It started with a secret. In the summer of 1933, as America choked on the dust of the Great Depression, a private train car slipped out of New York City. On board were men who owned the world, men with names like DuPont, Morgan, and Rockefeller. They weren't meeting for a board dinner. They were meeting to discuss a problem in the White House. That problem was Franklin D. Roosevelt. To the elite, FDR was a class traitor whose New Deal looked less like recovery and more like communism. They decided that the American experiment had failed. They wanted a dictator. But a coup needs more than money. It needs a face. It needs a hero the public will follow without question. They found that hero in Major General Smedley Butler, the maverick Marine. Little did they know, they had just approached the one man who would rather burn his own life down than watch them burn the Constitution. Who was Smedley Butler? By 1933, he was the most decorated Marine in U.S. history. 2 Medals of Honor, a man who had fought in the Philippines, China, and France. He was a soldier's soldier, beloved by the hundreds of thousands of veterans struggling to find bread in the breadlines. But Butler was changing. He had begun to look back at his career with a bitter clarity. He started giving speeches calling himself a gangster for capitalism, admitting he had spent decades securing fruit company profits in Central America and oil interests in China. He was a man with a guilty conscience and a massive platform. The plotters saw his popularity and his anger, and they mistook it for a willingness to seize power. They thought they could buy his soul. They were about to find out that Smedley Butler's loyalty wasn't for sale. To understand why the plotters thought a coup was possible, you have to look at the streets of Washington, D.C. in 1932. 20,000 World War I veterans, the bonus army, had marched on the Capitol, demanding the pay they were promised for their service. They were starving, living in shacks on the Anacostia Flats. Then, the unthinkable happened. On the orders of President Hoover, the U.S. Army turned on its own veterans. Tanks, bayonets, and tear gas were used to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur personally oversaw the burning of the veterans' shelters. Smedley Butler was there, standing with the marchers, horrified. The country was a powder keg. To the Wall Street elite, this was the perfect moment. They believed that if they could organize these 500,000 angry, discarded veterans into a private army, they could march on the White House and restore order. In July 1933, a man named Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman for a J.P. Morgan-linked firm, knocked on Butler's door. He didn't lead with treason. He led with patriotism. McGuire claimed he represented a group of wealthy veterans who wanted Butler to lead a new organization to fight for the gold standard. But as the meetings moved from hotel rooms to private clubs, the mask slipped. McGuire showed Butler bank statements worth millions. He spoke of a 500,000-man super-organization modeled after the fascist Coup d'État in France. The plan was simple. The veterans would march on Washington. They wouldn't kill FDR. They would simply help him. They would claim his health was failing and install a Secretary of General Welfare, a dictator in all but name, who would take over the presidency. Butler listened, his blood boiling, as they offered him the throne of America. The money behind the plot was staggering. McGuire told Butler they had $30 million ready immediately, roughly $700 million in today's value. This wasn't a fringe group of radicals. This was the American Liberty League. It included the leaders of General Motors, Chase Bank, and Standard Oil. These men viewed FDR's abandonment of the gold standard as a personal robbery. They believed that if they controlled the money and the military, the dumb American people, McGuire's words, wouldn't even realize a coup had happened. They were treating the American government like a company they were preparing for a hostile takeover. Butler realized that if he said no immediately, they would just find someone else, someone like Douglas MacArthur. So, Smedley Butler did something he had never done in combat. He played the spy. For months, Butler played along. He took the secret meetings, he listened to the plotters brag about their connections to the press and the military. He wanted names, he wanted proof. To ensure he wasn't just hearing a fairy tale, he brought in a trusted friend, Paul Comley French, a reporter for the Philadelphia Record. French met with McGuire under the guise of an ally and heard the exact same story. "We need a fascist government in this country," McGuire told him, "to save the nation from the communists." The plotters were so confident in their wealth that they stopped being careful. They believed Butler was in. They believed the veterans were ready. They were preparing the final logistics for the march on Washington that would end the American presidency as we knew it. In November 1934, Smedley Butler walked into a closed-door session of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee. He didn't just tell a story, he dropped a bomb. Under oath, he named the most powerful men in America. He detailed the millions of dollars, the private army, and the plan to turn FDR into a puppet. The room went silent. This was the most decorated soldier in the country accusing Wall Street of high treason. He testified that the plotters had told him, "The president is weak. He will come around when he realizes it's his own class directing the pressure." Butler's testimony was a masterclass in moral courage. He knew that by coming forward, he was ending his career and making enemies of the men who owned the world. But as he told the committee, "I am interested in only one thing, the preservation of our democracy." The reaction from the press was immediate and brutal. The New York Times called the story a gigantic hoax. Time magazine mocked Butler on its cover, portraying him as a paranoid kook. The men Butler named, the titans of industry, laughed it off as cocktail party chatter. The strategy was clear. If you can't disprove the message, destroy the messenger. They portrayed the hero of the Marine Corps as a man who had lost his mind. For years, the business plot was treated as a historical footnote, a crazy story told by a disgruntled general. The power of the men involved was so great that they were able to scrub the narrative from the public consciousness almost overnight. They didn't need to win in court. They only needed to win in the newspapers they owned. But then something happened. The Congressional Committee finished its investigation. For decades, the full report was suppressed, but when the final findings were leaked, they were chilling. The committee stated, "There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient." They found that Butler was telling the absolute truth. The business plot wasn't a hoax, it was a verified conspiracy. Yet, despite this, not a single person was arrested. No subpoenas were issued to the DuPonts or the Morgans. The committee had found the smoking gun of treason, but the government was too afraid to pull the trigger on the men who funded the country. The plot was defeated by Smedley Butler's honesty, but the plotters were protected by their bank accounts. The historical record is clear enough to render a judgment. In 1934, powerful financial and industrial interests explored, seriously and deliberately, the replacement of democratic governance with an authoritarian regime that would protect capital from accountability. That effort failed not because the system was immune, but because it encountered an anomaly, a man who could not be bought. The business plot was real, credible, and dangerous. Its architects were not radicals on the fringe, but respected men of wealth, pedigree, and access. They were never imprisoned, never disgraced, and never truly exposed to consequence. History did not punish them, it absorbed them. The verdict, then, is not one of closure, but of condition. The coup did not succeed by force, but its logic survived intact. The United States learned no institutional lesson from the episode beyond how to bury it politely. Wealth retained its proximity to power. Industry retained its leverage over war and policy. The language changed, the tactics softened, but the objective remained the same: governance without the inconvenience of democracy. Smedley Butler testified. Congress listened. The public forgot. That sequence itself is the final evidence. The business plot was not an aberration. It was a stress test, and the system passed only because one individual refused the offer. Remove Butler from the equation and the outcome becomes disturbingly uncertain. So the judgment must be rendered against complacency itself. Democracy was not saved in 1933, it was spared, temporarily. The machinery that made the plot possible was left intact, refined, and normalized. Influence replaced uniforms, lobbyists replaced militias. Private capital learned it didn't need a coup, it only needed patience. The business plot stands as a warning etched into the margins of American history. The greatest threat to a republic is not always open rebellion, but quiet consensus among those who believe the country is something to be managed rather than represented. The question is no longer whether such an offer could be made again. The question is whether, in an age of institutional obedience and transactional loyalty, there would still be someone willing to say no. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button. It helps the algorithm show this hidden history to more people. And subscribe to your channel for more stories that textbooks usually leave out. Because if we don't remember the plots of the past, we won't recognize the ones in our future. Thanks for watching.